Hey and welcome back to the thewazchronicle, and in this video we'll be focusing on the Treaty of Versailles. What was the Treaty of Versailles? Why was it important? And what were the consequences of it? So let's look at some context. What actually happened? We know that Erzberger signed the armistice, and as a result Germany was to be punished. The question was, how were they punished? And who decided this? So let's rewind a bit. Let's go and look at what happened before the treaty. We know Germany was in the midst of a revolution in 1918, and also the Weimar Republic had just been set up. We also know that Germany had threats from the extreme far left and the far right. So who actually dealt with the punishment of Germany? Enter the Big Three. Now the Big Three were super important because they were the Big Three powers who decided the fate of Germany. Germany was to be punished, but the question was, how severely do we punish them? The first member of the Big Three was a gentleman by the name of George Clemençeau, who was the French Prime Minister. He deeply resented Germany, and he felt that Germany should be punished as harshly as possible. The reason for this was that he actually was the Prime Minister during the First World War, and he saw the horrors of it. And most of the destruction that occurred within the borders of France. So he felt Germany should be punished so severely that it would never start another war. Now on to the second member of the Big Three, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain. Now he was in a bit of a dilemma. You see, he wanted Germany to be punished, but not as severely as France. However, he did want to be punished, and his hands were kind of tied. See, on the one hand, the British public were telling him, you need to punish Germany as severely as possible, and the whole of the British public had been up in arms, making sure that this would happen. However, secretly, David Lloyd George didn't want to punish Germany too harshly because he wanted to use them as a trading partner, and he also worried that punishing them too harshly would start another war, which you all know it did. And the third member of the Big Three was Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States of America. He believed that Germany should not be punished too harshly. He was the complete opposite of George Clemençeau, and this ended up bringing them to loggerheads when they discussed the punishment of Germany. Additionally, you must understand that Woodrow Wilson was trying to make sure that Europe was stable, so he put forward this idea of 14 points, and his 14 points meant that all of Europe would have stability. One of those 14 points was the League of Nations, which he believed was the police force of the world, would have all of Europe join it, and America, and this would stop future conflict or war. So I'll discuss the terms of the treaty further in the video. It's quite important to understand what actually happened. There were massive disagreements on how Germany should be treated. As I mentioned before, Clemençeau and Woodrow Wilson just didn't get along. Lloyd George again was trying to put forward views from both sides, and on top of that, none of them could agree on the economic punishments of Germany or militarily, and this meant the treaty took a fair bit of time to hash out. As you can see in the picture, Germany after the Treaty of Versailles was completely decimated. It was almost as if Germany was going to implode and the Weimar Republic was set to collapse. There's one very important point to mention, and that is Woodrow Wilson. Now you know Woodrow Wilson wanted a stable Europe, he wanted peace, he pushed the 14 points, and most importantly he set up the League of Nations, the policemen of the world. Now the problem with that was this: Woodrow Wilson, after signing the Treaty of Versailles, had a stroke and had to leave office. After him, the next president, Warren Harding, decided he does not want to inherit the problems of Europe, and he withdrew America from the League of Nations. This proved catastrophic for the League, as instead of being seen as a lion with massive teeth that could scare off the smaller powers that tried to start war, they were actually more of a rabbit. See, all the armies of France and Britain had fought in a war, and they weren't ready to take on the problems of other countries. The only country that was America, and they had decided to withdraw. The League of Nations was now seen as a joke. The weakness of the League and also the harsh treaty eventually lead to the rise of Hitler. Hitler decides that he's going to try and take back the land that was taken off them in the Treaty of Versailles, and he wanted to see what the League of Nations did. As I mentioned earlier, the League was too scared to do anything, and as a result, Hitler's gamble paid off. The terms of the treaty did eventually punish Germany extremely harshly. I'll discuss those in more detail later on. However, you must understand that Clemençeau, wanting to punish Germany harshly, did manage to get his revenge, but it was at a cost. You see, by punishing Germany, eventually, later on, it led to conflict and eventually the rise of the midget with a mustache, Adolf Hitler. As I mentioned earlier, on the 11th of November 1918, Matthias Erzberger decided that he, along with other representatives, would sign the armistice ending the war. However, the punishment for the war had not been dealt with yet, and that took place on the 28th of June 1919. It took place in the form of the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed at Versailles Palace in the Hall of Mirrors. So what was the Treaty of Versailles, to be exact? The simplest way to remember the Treaty of Versailles is lamb. That's right, lamb, as in baby sheep. The first year of a sheep's life, it's called a lamb. And you might be wondering, what's that got to do with the treaty? Lamb is short for land, army, money and blame. Those are the four main factors of the Treaty of Versailles. And if you remember it like that, it's pretty simple to regurgitate in an exam, or if you're explaining the treaty to anyone. Before I go into the treaty, I want to just explain the context to it a little so you understand what happened. When the Treaty of Versailles was formally ratified, it consisted of three countries. So there was Britain, France and America. You had Lloyd George from Britain, you had Clemençeau from France, and you had Woodrow Wilson from America. These three people all decided what would happen to Germany. Germany itself was not represented. This left a bitter taste for Germany, as they felt their grievances were never heard. So let's look at the treaty itself. Let's start with the first part of lamb, which is land. Alsace and Lorraine was lost to France. As you know, Alsace and Lorraine was gained through the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871. This was a massive slap in the face for Germany. Eupen and Malmedy was also lost to Belgium. You also had Posen in West Prussia, which was lost to Poland. That was a massive problem because a lot of German citizens and German-speaking people lived there, which meant that Germany was essentially split into two. You also had plebiscites, and during those plebiscites they decided whether to stay with Germany, whether they become part of the League of Nations, which is like the police force of the world, or they go to the other country. Upper Silesia decided to become part of Poland. Northern Schleswig decided to become part of Denmark, and Danzig was made into an international city. As you know, that meant that Germany's ports were no longer secure. The biggest loss of territory was the Saar coalfields. See, Germany had to give the output, what they made from the Saar coalfields, over to France. This was a massive problem because coal, not only was it rare, it was extremely valuable, and that meant that economically Germany had been stunted. Finally, we have the Rhineland. The Rhineland was an area between France and Germany. This became demilitarized. That meant that Germany could no longer bring any troops in that area. If they did, they would be sanctioned by the League of Nations. So overall, territorially, Germany was decimated. It lost 13% of its European territories and 10% of its German-speaking population. Bear that in mind, German-speaking people had been sent to other countries. When plebiscites later happened, they decided to come back, and the evil spawn of Satan, Adolf Hitler, decides to use that to start a war, which you learn about later. All of its colonial territories were taken off them, and any investments they had made were also taken from them. 50% of its iron and 15% of its coal reserves were stripped off them, just because these territories were taken. So let's move on to the second part of the Treaty of Versailles, or in this case, the second part of lamb, the army. The army was reduced to 100,000 men. They weren't allowed any more than that, and this was the army that would protect their borders from any foreign invaders. On top of that, Germany were no longer allowed any heavy artillery. That had been useful in the war and decimated much of the Allied territory. However, they could have artillery within their borders. The naval side of things was largely dictated by Britain. See, Britain decided that it would be a good idea to reduce the navy of Germany. And the reason they did this was the naval race. Between 1906 and 1911, Britain and Germany were engaged in a naval race. Britain had built a boat called the Dreadnought. The Dreadnought was called the 5 Minuten. Within 5 minutes, it could destroy any ship in the water. Germany decides to copy that and make their own version of the Dreadnought. This causes a naval race, with both sides building ships as fast as they can. Eventually, by 1911, Britain wins that race, but not without thinking that Germany are hot on its heels, and also a massive threat to Britain's naval superiority. So when the time comes to punish Germany, they are the first ones to make sure the navy is greatly reduced. So what actually happened to the navy? Germany was told to reduce its navy to 6 battleships and cruisers, 12 destroyers and torpedo boats, and not a single submarine was allowed. See, submarines were one of the biggest problems during the First World War, so they made sure they were no longer there. The rest of the fleet was to be destroyed. So on to the third part of the Treaty of Versailles, or the third part of LAM, which is money. Now, money is quite simple. All you need to remember is that the reparations, which are the actual cost of the damages that Germany was blamed for during the war, were to be repaid, and the amount that was eventually fixed was 136 billion marks, or in English money it's 6.6 billion. 6.6 is a simple way to remember it. 6.6 billion pound was a humongous amount of money. It pretty much crippled the German economy, and it allowed the extremist parties to blame the Weimar Republic for accepting such a huge amount. Remember the November criminals. So the last part of LAM was how Germany was blamed for the First World War. Now, it came in 3 parts. You had the war guilt clause, you had the Dolchstoss, and you had the diktat. I'll go through each one individually. So the Treaty of Versailles was split into articles, and there's one article in particular that the Germans hated. It was Article 231, and it stated that Germany had caused the war and also was to blame for the war. Germany obviously did not agree. The war guilt clause meant that because Germany was blamed for the war, it had to pay for the war. And that was a massive sticking point with a lot of Germans. The second part of blame lies in the idea of the diktat. The diktat is this idea that the Germans felt that the Treaty of Versailles was a dictated peace. They didn't actually get a say in it. They felt that the people that were in charge, in this case Britain, France and America, had decided what was going to happen to them without listening to any of the grievances. They felt super hard done by. Not only that, they called the Treaty of Versailles a diktat, and they thought that really they should make some concessions, so allow the Germans to have some leeway, because when you think about it logically, it was the Kaiser that caused the war, not the German people. So why are the German people getting punished for the Kaiser's mistake when he's off in Holland living a happy life? The final part of blame lay with Dolchstoss. The Dolchstoss was this idea that Germany was stabbed in the back. Now, when Matthias Erzberger and the representatives met and signed the armistice, they agreed to end the war. However, a lot of Germans, as I mentioned before, were not happy with this idea because they did not feel they were losing. They just thought they were retreating. So, as a result of that, a lot of Germans felt that those politicians had stabbed the German army in the back. Hence, the stab in the back theory, the Dolchstoss. It could be argued that this was the most dangerous of the 3 aspects of the blame, because this meant that extreme right-wing nationalists and left-wing communists could use the argument that the army had been stabbed in the back and the people had been stabbed in the back, hence why we don't want the Treaty of Versailles and we want to reverse it. Erzberger and those who signed the armistice came to be known as the November criminals. This was a name that Hitler used later on to discredit the Weimar Republic, stating that they were untrustworthy and they were humiliating the German people. So we've looked at the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. We know about land, army, money and blame, and how each of them caused people to like or dislike the treaty, dependent on which country you were from. But the question still remains, what was the actual impact of the treaty? How did it affect people and countries in the long term and the short term? Again, I think this picture really sums up Germany's view of the Treaty of Versailles. They were in absolute shock. They didn't expect to be punished so harshly and to be the only ones to be punished. As a result of this, Germany felt they had been hard done by. The impact of the Treaty of Versailles is clearly evident if you look at Germany before World War I and then after the Treaty of Versailles. It was like night and day. It was like 2 different countries. Also, the impact of the Treaty of Versailles was largely undermined by Woodrow Wilson. I've mentioned this before earlier in the video, but it's worth stating again. The fact that they created the League and don't join it means that the Treaty of Versailles is pretty much an empty paper, because there's nothing to back it up. Another impact, both long term and short, was on the Weimar Republic. The Treaty of Versailles pretty much turned public opinion against the Weimar Republic. It meant they had an uphill battle just trying to get people on side, and as a result eventually the Weimar Republic collapsed. In the longer term, one of the biggest impacts of the Treaty of Versailles was how the extreme left and extreme right viewed it. For example, Hitler saw it as an absolute shambles, and he wrote in his book Mein Kampf how he wanted to destroy the Treaty of Versailles as one of his main aims, and it's what made him popular. With Hitler viewing the Treaty of Versailles as something that he had to overturn, and also seeing the weakness of the League of Nations, Hitler did exactly that. He decided to walk out of the disarmament conference in 1933, pretty much violating the Treaty of Versailles, and what that meant was he decided that he was going to rearm Germany. He then decides that he is going to do the Anschluss. The Anschluss is when Austria-Hungary and Germany unify. Now this was specifically stated in the Treaty of Versailles. It was not to happen. Yet because of the weakness of the League, that is exactly what he did. Then he decides to invade the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland was land owned by Czechoslovakia, but it had German-speaking people there. So his argument was simple: I'm taking back Lebensraum, which is land for my German-speaking people. And as he did this, the League just stood by idly. Hitler must have felt like a kid in a sweet shop. He could take what he wants and no one would say anything. However, this was not the case. Having broken the treaty so many times, both Britain and France thought enough is enough, and they guaranteed the protection of Poland. Having been explicitly told not to invade Poland, Hitler did exactly the opposite. He felt he no longer needed to follow the Treaty of Versailles. The League of Nations was an absolute joke. So he did just that. He split Poland between himself and Russia, in particular Stalin, and he said, you can have half and I'll have half. Britain and France did not expect this. However, they decided enough was enough, and they declared war. So now you know the story of Adolf Hitler and his invasion of Poland and how it started World War II. But the question still remains, how does this link to the Treaty of Versailles at all? And the answer is this: the Treaty of Versailles pretty much single-handedly caused the rise of Hitler. Had the treaty not been as harsh as it was, the extremist parties would never have gotten the power or the clout that they did. Obviously there was loads of other factors such as the death of Stresemann and the Wall Street crash and so on and so forth, but it's hard to argue against the idea that the Treaty of Versailles, one of its lasting impacts was the fact that it actually caused World War II. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. I hope it was helpful. I know it was a bit long, but I tried to get in as much detail as I could. If you do get a moment, please do look at other videos, and if you do get a chance, please do subscribe. It does help me massively. Thank you for your support.